On April 15, 1885, a horse and rider delivered a message to Sheriff James McAfee of Taney County, Missouri. The message told him 2 fugitives wanted to surrender. The fugitives, brothers Frank and Tubal Taylor, had been hiding in the woods nearby. In return for turning themselves in, the Taylors wanted McAfee to promise to protect them from vigilantes who were hunting them. After receiving assurances, the Taylors allowed deputies to take them into custody, and Sheriff McAfee locked them up in the county jail. At about 10 o'clock that night, between 75 and 100 armed vigilantes rode into the city of Forsyth, where the jail was located. Using sledgehammers, the men battered down the door to the jail and broke into the cell that was holding the Taylors. The brothers begged for their lives as the vigilantes dragged them away. The next morning, roughly 2.5 miles outside of town, a deputy and a friend discovered the bodies of the Taylor brothers. They were hanging from the limb of a scrub oak tree. A sign was pinned to Tubal's shirt. It warned that the hanged men were the first, but not the last, to get justice at the hands of a new vigilante group. It was signed the Baldknobbers. It was the first violent and public atrocity committed by a terrifying group of marauders in a little county that was carved out of Missouri's Ozark wilderness. The leaders of the group that called itself the Baldknobbers started out with relatively good intentions. They wanted to tamp down the crime that had been rising since the Civil War. But along the way, they became a law unto themselves, threatening and attacking anyone they deemed immoral or an enemy. Over time, it began to feel like the vigilante group that had formed to fight crime was more dangerous than the criminals. Then, an anti-vigilance group emerged to fight the vigilante group, and the violence in Taney County and the surrounding area grew worse than ever. At the height of their influence, their membership spread to adjacent counties. Neighbor turned against neighbor, and sometimes family member turned against family member. At least 13 people, and maybe more, were murdered. Dozens more lost their homes or were chased out of the area. And it all started with a mountain of a man named Nathaniel Kinney and the murder of his friend, James Everett. From Black Barrel Media, this is Legends of the Old West. I'm your host, Chris Wimmer, and this season we're telling the story of Missouri's vigilante wars, which were instigated by a terrifying group called the Baldknobbers. This is Episode 1, Frontier Justice. At the time of the Taylor brothers' lynching, Nathaniel Kinney was 40 years old. He was born in New York, lived in Virginia, and fought for the Union in the Civil War. He never rose above the rank of private, though he sometimes told people he'd been a captain. They believed him because he was an imposing, confident man. He stood at least 6 feet 2 inches tall, maybe more, and weighed about 300 pounds. Kinney had a colorful past before coming to Taney County. In Kansas, he'd been a teamster and had joined militias in Topeka and Springfield, and he'd been a saloon keeper. But nothing lasted long, and in early 1883, he decided to move his family to southwest Missouri. He bought a farm a few miles from the town of Kirbyville in Taney County. Soon, Kinney noticed the corruption, crime, and the county's staggering debt. It seemed to Kinney that the problems in Taney County rose out of nowhere, but in reality, they had been building for 20 years since the Civil War. On the southern edge of Missouri, along the border with Arkansas, the war devastated Taney County. The county desperately needed money to rebuild, and that opened the door to problems. The situation was political and complicated, but in essence, taxes went up, and small farmers like Nathaniel Kinney were understandably angry. To add insult to injury, crime seemed to be rampant. Even though the legendary James Gang was gone, outlaws and troublemakers were everywhere. Money from taxes wasn't enough to pay for more than 2 or 3 lawmen at a time. and the lawmen weren't enough to expel all the bandits who roamed the county. The bandits robbed citizens, stole horses and cattle, and started fights in saloons. Nathaniel Kinney itched for a reason to start his own militia and bring his own brand of justice to Taney County. He got his wish on October 22, 1884, when a roughneck named Al Layton was acquitted for murdering a saloon owner who was Kinney's friend. 1 year earlier, Layton had gone to the bar of James Everett in Forsyth looking for a good time. Layton had a bad reputation for starting fights, and sure enough, he and a friend started to argue after several rounds of drinks and billiards. The argument turned into a fight. Both men threw punches. In the heat of the moment, Layton tried to draw his revolver. James Everett, the saloon owner, intervened and wrestled Layton outside onto the porch. Everett told Layton he didn't want to hurt him, but he didn't want any more trouble either. Spectators warned Everett to take Layton's weapon before letting him go, but Everett didn't heed the warning. Everett let go of Layton. Layton stood up, dusted off his clothes, and fired 2 shots at Everett. James Everett died instantly. Next, Layton turned to Everett's brother and shot him in the shoulder. Before anyone had time to react, Layton galloped away on his horse. It's not clear where he went or for how long, but soon after the altercation, he surrendered to Sheriff John Mosley. A judge set a trial date for October 22, 1884, 1 year after the shooting. Layton posted bond and was free to go about his business until the trial. But just days before the court session, another killing took place that caused the residents of Taney County to place even more importance on the outcome of Al Layton's trial. On October 7, 1884, 3 weeks before the trial of Al Layton, a young man named Newton Harrell went to speak to his mother, who was living just outside Forsyth. Harrell was upset. His mother had a common-law husband named Amos Ring, who was a notorious horse thief. It's not clear what Ring did that particular time to anger Newton Harrell, but when Harrell arrived at his mother's house, he gave Ring a piece of his mind. The argument escalated quickly. Ring took a piece of wood from the stove and advanced on Harrell. It's hard to know if Ring meant to hurt his de facto stepson or just scare him. But either way, Harrell quickly seized the opportunity to settle the score. He drew his revolver and shot the older man dead. The murders of James Everett and Amos Ring infuriated many of the residents of Taney County, and they started to view the upcoming trial of Al Layton as a test case. They were anxious to see if the courts would uphold the law and punish Layton, and then, later, punish Newton Harrell. As the son of a Baldknobber later recalled, the community's feeling was this: crimes like murder, robbery, arson, and horse theft had been going unpunished for long enough. Law-abiding citizens needed to organize and dole out punishment themselves. When the Layton murder trial ended with a verdict of not guilty on October 22, 1884, 3 weeks after the murder of Amos Ring, a fuse was lit. Charges of corruption and bribery on both sides flew back and forth. There were 2 major reactions to Layton's acquittal. First, it galvanized the opposition to the Democratic group who ran the local government at the time. As a result, in November, Republicans swept the elections. Second, Nathaniel Kinney called for a secret meeting in Forsyth. Kinney's meeting was held at the bar that used to belong to James Everett and now belonged to Everett's brother. The exact date of the meeting isn't known, but sources place it no later than January 1885. Kinney chaired the meeting, and he and 12 others discussed what they should do if Newton Harrell was found not guilty like Al Layton. Then they started drawing up resolutions for a vigilance committee. The 13 men did not have a name for their vigilance committee yet, but they did each wear a small badge. The badges were made of red silk, approximately 5 inches by 2 inches. Stitched onto the badges was the motto, "Stand up for Taney County and law and order." Each member had to swear a long oath that demanded the utmost in secrecy and loyalty to the order. Any deviation was subject to punishment by the other members, even if their decision was to have a member hanged. The group probably earned its nickname, the Baldknobbers, after its first large-scale recruitment meeting on April 5, 1885. The meeting was held on a treeless ridge near Kinney's little town of Kirbyville. The ridge, with no trees, was known in local parlance as a bald knob. The Vigilantes selected the location because it gave them a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside. It would be tough for anyone to spy on them or ambush them. The morning of the big recruitment meeting, Kinney went to the ridge alone to double-check the security of the location. Soon, a handful of men cautiously approached the meeting place. They kept their guard up against being led into some kind of trap until they saw Kinney, who stood at the top of the hill and greeted the men as they arrived. When the assembly reached about 100 men, Kinney stood up to address the crowd. There's no direct record of his words, but newspaper accounts tell of a fear-mongering speech about the bloody shirt of James Everett and fears of losing life, liberty, and property. When the crowd was whipped up and cheering, it collectively voted to form a vigilance committee with Kinney as its chief. In truth, the committee had already been formed by the original 13 men, and now one of those members read the oath to the new inductees. The 100 swore to abide, and Kinney imposed a rule that forbade the use of written records of any kind, so their activities would be secret. They also adopted a semi-military structure. They organized themselves into companies, which they called legions. Each legion had a captain as a commander, and they decided their first order of business was to make sure Newton Harrell faced justice for killing Amos Ring. Late at night on April 7, 1885, 2 days after the first official meeting of the Baldknobbers, a company of 70 to 100 armed men rode into Forsyth for the first of 2 times in as many weeks. They surrounded the county jail where Newton Harrell was awaiting trial for killing Amos Ring 7 months earlier. Harrell heard the commotion outside and knew something really bad was about to happen. Harrell shouted for help. The armed riders demanded the sheriff give them the keys to the jail. The sheriff was no longer John Mosley. He had been replaced by James McAfee, which was significant because McAfee was a charter member of the Baldknobbers. But even McAfee thought this was going too far. He refused to give his fellow vigilantes the keys to the jail. The riders backed down this time, but before riding away, they entered the courthouse next to the jail. On the judge's bench, they put a length of rope that was tied into a noose. It was a clear and obvious warning. If the court didn't punish Harrell appropriately, the vigilantes would do it themselves. In response to the threat, a circuit judge had the good sense to grant Newton Harrell a continuance of his trial and transfer him to another county for safekeeping. Several months later, and still terrified of the Baldknobbers, Harrell escaped from the jail. He eventually faced trial elsewhere in Missouri, but in the near time, a member of the Baldknobbers, who owned a newspaper in Taney County, wrote an editorial in which he justified the vigilantes' actions with Harrell and warned that the county could expect more. Before long, the group found its chance. On the same day Baldknobbers tried to get Newton Harrell, a criminal named Frank Taylor harassed a store owner and set off a chain of events that led to the first acts of violence by the vigilantes. The Taylors were a big family, and brothers Frank and Tubal lived about 5 miles outside Forsyth. They led a gang of young men who specialized in petty crimes. The crimes were mostly brawling, stealing livestock or chickens, and burglarizing homes. But they were not above robbing children and old women, and over time, they graduated from burglary to armed robbery. And as they became more brazen, the brothers loved to show off. On several occasions, they rode into town and invited everyone to drink at their expense. To pay for the drinks, They flaunted the cash they had stolen from around the county. The Taylors were also cruel. When a man named Alexander Kinney criticized them in public, they mutilated 3 of his cows. The gruesome act committed against innocent animals placed the Taylor brothers squarely in the sights of the Baldknobbers. After the perceived lack of justice in the Al Layton case and the Newton Harrell case, the Vigilantes were not going to let the Taylor brothers slip through their fingers. The events of the next 48 hours unfolded quickly. On April 7, 1885, the same day Newton Harrell narrowly escaped vigilante justice, Frank Taylor sauntered into John Dickinson's general store, about 5 miles northeast of Forsyth. Taylor wanted to buy a pair of boots on credit, but Dickinson refused. He had previously extended credit to Frank, and Frank had never paid him. Frank became furious. He cussed out Dickinson, wrecked the store, and left broken merchandise scattered all over the floor. He also threatened to kill Dickinson if the store owner charged him with vandalism. Frank stormed out and rode back to Forsyth. In town, he went to find his brother. Tubal Taylor had just surrendered to authorities for the crimes against Alexander Kinney's cattle. It's likely that Tubal thought he'd get off with a slap on the wrist, or maybe not even have to go to trial at all. When Frank found his brother, it certainly appeared as though the law was going easy on him. Tubal wasn't being held in jail. Instead, Sheriff McAfee had placed him in the care of a deputy, whose only job was to keep an eye on Tubal for the time being. At that moment, the deputy was standing with Tubal on the veranda of the Everett Saloon. Frank dismounted in front of the saloon, and as soon as he did, Tubal jumped from the veranda. He leapt into Frank's saddle, and with a yell, he rode away. Frank was arrested for aiding the escape of a prisoner, but he posted bail and rode away as well. The Taylor brothers were free, and based on what they did next, they seemed to be more cocky than ever. When they returned to John Dickinson's store, they made the last mistake of their lives. After Frank Taylor had vandalized John Dickinson's store, Dickinson had filed a complaint against Frank. A grand jury had indicted Frank on a charge of disturbing the peace. Frank had posted a bond and was free to go until he faced a court hearing. And while all those things played out, John Dickinson had secretly joined the Baldknobbers. If Frank Taylor was stupid enough or cocky enough to show up again, he would unknowingly deliver himself into a very bad situation. 3 days after Frank ransacked Dickinson's store, he showed up again. On April 10, 1885, Frank walked in with his brother Tubal and a friend named Elijah Sublette. The 3 roughnecks supposedly exchanged curt pleasantries with Dickinson. And then, Frank grabbed John Dickinson by the throat. The 2 men struggled until Frank pulled out a .32 caliber revolver and shot the older man in the mouth. The bullet knocked out several of Dickinson's teeth and took off part of his jawbone, but the wounds were not life-threatening. The Taylors and Sublette started for the door. On the way out, Frank fired at Dickinson 2 or 3 more times. 1 bullet hit him and lodged in Dickinson's shoulder. The gunfire drew Dickinson's wife out of the back of the store. The intruders had no idea she was there, and when she ran out to help her husband, she was hit with one of Frank's bullets. Frank and the others fled and left the Dickinsons bleeding on the floor. Luckily, John Dickinson and his wife survived, and they could certainly identify the gunmen. Their words reached John Dickinson's new vigilante friends, the Baldknobbers. As soon as the news of the attempted murder of the Dickinsons reached Forsyth, a messenger rode to Nathaniel Kinney. A few hours after the attack, more than 100 vigilantes were in the saddle and on the hunt for the Taylor brothers and Elijah Sublette. Residents who were not sworn Baldknobbers joined the hunt too. According to the memory of one of the Baldknobbers, they spread out in smaller groups to search for Frank and Tubal. They'd heard the Taylors and Sublette were heading south to Arkansas, and some raced ahead as fast as they could, to try to find the fugitives on popular trails. Others went more slowly to scour mountains, ravines, and dense brush. It was a daunting task to search for 3 men who could be hiding just about anywhere in the vast lands of the Ozark wilderness. The vigilantes searched for 5 days. Then the Taylor brothers saved them the trouble of continuing. Somehow, they doubled back to Forsyth without encountering any of the hunters and hid at the home of either friends or family. Elijah Sublette managed to flee to parts unknown and hide for several weeks. There are different accounts of why the brothers turned themselves into the sheriff, but one says the pair were so afraid of the Baldknobbers that they decided to take their chances with the law, presumably without knowing that the sheriff was a member of the vigilante group. Another version suggests that when the Taylors heard about the reward for their capture, they devised a plan to get some of it for themselves. They would enlist some of their friends to hand them over to Sheriff McAfee. Then, when they posted bond, the friends would split the reward money with the brothers. Whatever the Taylors were thinking, they almost certainly thought they could win an acquittal like Al Layton, especially since the Dickinsons weren't dead. So, on April 15th, they sent a message to the sheriff that said they wanted to surrender in return for a promise of protection. 2 sheriff's deputies took the brothers into custody and locked them up in the county jail. That night, at about 10 o'clock, 75 to 100 armed men rode to within 10 yards or so of the jail. Nathaniel Kinney started to give orders. The jail was made of several layers of logs and oak planks, so the Taylors couldn't hear what was being said. But they could definitely hear the commotion, and they were rightfully terrified. While the Taylor brothers cowered in their jail cell, someone began battering the lock of the outer door. Supposedly, it was Kinney who delivered the final sledgehammer blow that split the metal and allowed the Baldknobbers to pour into the cell. Dozens more surrounded the building. No one interfered with their work, and the sheriff was nowhere to be seen. The Taylors screamed and cried and tried to hide under their wooden beds. They begged for mercy, but the vigilantes hauled them out. Once outside, the Baldknobbers tied the 2 with rope and threw them onto waiting horses like they were sacks of flour. The next morning, a deputy and a carpenter discovered the bodies of the Taylor brothers hanging from the limb of an oak tree on the outskirts of Forsyth. Attached to Tubal Taylor's shirt, they found a placard that said, "Beware, these are the first victims to the wrath of outraged citizens. More will follow. The Baldknobbers." A coroner's inquest was held to determine the fate of the Taylor brothers. Everyone knew what had happened and who had done it, but the coroner's jury returned a neutral verdict. It said death was by hanging by 100 unknown persons. In other words, the Baldknobbers had the support of their community. And with that support, the vigilante group was emboldened to begin purging Taney County of people they deemed undesirable. After hanging the Taylors and getting away with it, the Baldknobbers started a method of scaring away residents that they called warning out. Warning out involved a group of Baldknobbers riding out to a victim's house after dark. They would fire a few shots into the air until they were sure the residents were listening. They'd yell a stern warning to leave. After that, they would leave a bunch of hickory switches on the doorstep. The number of switches represented the number of days the victim had to leave the county. If they didn't leave, the vigilantes would pay a return visit, and it would not be pleasant. Among the first people to leave Taney County were, not surprisingly, the parents of Frank and Tubal Taylor. Then, dozens of other families followed their example. No one knows exactly how many people left the county, but some historians estimate that in the months following the Taylors' hangings, hundreds of people moved away. Soon, it was evident that it wasn't just criminals or troublemakers who were warned out. Some were pushed out because of their political beliefs. Some had simply annoyed members of the vigilante group. One young man, who was a friend of the Taylors, received a note to leave because he talked too much. One citizen received a warning that a fence he'd built near a public road needed to be moved back. The fence inconvenienced some of his Baldknobber neighbors, and they ordered him to adjust it. He refused, and the next day the entire fence was torn down. Another man was in a legal dispute over some land that was owned by a widow. The woman was in danger of losing the land to foreclosure, and the Baldknobbers wanted her to keep it. The man received a letter that made it clear that if he continued haggling with the widow, he would regret it. Besides enforcing what they interpreted as the correct application of the law, Baldknobbers felt that their authority extended to matters of private morality. If a man was proven to or rumored to abuse his wife or children, he could expect a visit from the Vigilantes. By the summer of 1885, it was clear to many people in Taney County that the vigilante gang had gone way beyond its original purpose of trying to punish obvious wrongdoers. Members of the group were drunk on their own power. They were taking land and stealing livestock under the guise of upholding the law. Their first official act, the hanging of the Taylor brothers, had happened just a couple months earlier, but the Baldknobbers were already harassing people all over the county and making plenty of enemies along the way. In the summer of 1885, some of the more bold residents of Taney County chose an unusual venue to express their displeasure with the sanctimonious and dangerous behavior of the Baldknobbers. Nathaniel Kinney was a prominent figure at a local church. It's a little hard to understand, but it looks like he led regular Bible study lessons and may have been the leader of the church's Sunday school program. Even though he didn't conduct actual church services, it seems like his Bible study lessons were well attended. One day, as people started to arrive at the church for one of Kinney's lessons, they discovered two ominous displays that seemed to be warnings for Kinney. On the front door of the church, a miniature coffin was tacked to the wood. Inside the coffin was a buckshot ball and a note that read, "To old Kinney, pissing and death is his favorite role." Then, inside the church, there was a second display. A coat had been placed on a chair or a pew. Near the coat, there was a sign on which someone had drawn a skull and crossbones, and written the words, "Captain Kinney's." The two displays appeared to say that Kinney was marked for death. But if they were warnings or promises of violence, Kinney wasn't concerned. He left them up for everyone to see, and he used them to reveal the people who had placed them there. When the Cogburn family arrived at church, Kinney studied their reactions when they saw the displays, and he was convinced they were the culprits. A tense rivalry was developing between Nathaniel Kinney and the Cogburn family, and it would explode the following year. But months before that happened, the Baldknobbers went after other targets who were accused of disturbing Kinney's religious activities. In September 1885, local authorities issued a warrant for the arrest of two brothers named Mercer on the charge of disturbing public worship. On September 29th, Deputy Sheriff Arthur Kissey prepared a warrant. Kissey was a Baldknobber and a brother of Alexander Kissey, whose cattle had been killed by the Taylor brothers. Deputy Kissey took the warrant to the Mercer family cabin. Kissey entered the cabin through the back door. Inside, he found Henry Mercer, one of the two brothers named in the warrant. When Henry saw the deputy coming, he grabbed his shotgun and ducked out the front door. But he immediately discovered the shotgun was unloaded. Henry ran around the back of the house so he could grab his other gun, which he had left leaning against the rear wall of the cabin. Deputy Kissey spun around and met Henry Mercer at the back door. Kissey shot Mercer in the chest and killed him instantly. As for the other Mercer brother, whose name was probably Ephraim, very little is known. Vague references in sources say he was, quote, under heavy guard in Forsyth, but there's no further explanation. Presumably they meant he was being protected by anti-Baldknobber citizens. If so, it appears as though he stayed safe. But the killing of Henry Mercer, who was better known as Buck Mercer, made 3 killings that could be attributed to the Baldknobbers. Even though Deputy Kinney was technically, legally acting in his official capacity as a lawman by serving a warrant, the warrant was far more of a complaint by the vigilante group than a genuine criminal problem. And that concept would only grow worse over the next few years. By the end of 1885, it was clear the Baldknobbers no longer had any criteria for harassing people. Neither political affiliation, nor a person's job, nor their social standing could protect them. The group's initial purpose of serving extra-legal justice to unpunished criminals was gone. From now on, a citizen was either one of them or not. The justice of the peace in a town in Taney County simply packed up and left because he couldn't dispense any real justice while the Baldknobbers were terrorizing the county. The situation in and around Taney County was in a downward spiral. There would be a huge and suspicious fire and 2 more killings, and the Vigilantes would expand their membership to neighboring counties. As the situation grew more desperate, a second vigilante group would form to battle the Baldknobbers. In the process, southern Missouri returned to something like a war zone. Next time on Legends of the Old West, the Baldknobbers add new members in new counties. Their strength and power grows, and they're responsible for 2 more killings. The governor of Missouri tries to intervene with mixed results. And then infuriated citizens form a second vigilance committee to fight the first vigilance committee. Total chaos descends on Taney County next week on Legends of the Old West. Members of our Black Barrel Plus program don't have to wait week to week to receive new episodes. They receive the entire season to binge all at once with no commercials, and they also receive exclusive bonus episodes. Sign up now through the link in the show notes or on our website, blackbarrelmedia.com. This series was researched and written by Julia Bricklin. Original music by Rob Valier. I'm your host and producer, Chris Wimmer. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Check out our website, blackbarrelmedia.com, for more details, and join us on social media. We're at Old West Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And all of our episodes are on YouTube. Just search for Legends of the Old West Podcast. Thanks for listening.